Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti. Siamo qui, con ospite, ehm, Vitaly Mykhaylovskiy, che, siamo davvero molto contenti, di avere qui con noi. Vitaly è, professore di storia ehm, alla Borys Grinchenko, Università di Kiev, ed è chair del Dipartimento di Storia Ucraina. Il suo campo di ricerca è soprattutto la tarda storia medievale dell'Europa centro-orientale, storia ucraina e storia del, Commonwealth polacco, lituano. Ci raggiunge per, parlare di Kyivan Rus e del suo ruolo, nella radici, diciamo, dell'identità o del sentimento nazionale ucraino, ma anche dei suoi legami con, l'idea di identità nazionale russa. Ehm, l'intervista sarà condotta in inglese, quindi ora diciamo cambio, faccio uno switch di lingua e passiamo all'inglese, ecco. Vitaly, hi, thank you so much for coming. And as I mentioned in Italian, the episode that we're recording today is going to be about Kyivan Rus, and it's a really important uh, role in, determining the um, Ukrainian national sentiment and identity, but also in its relationship with Russia. So the first thing I would like to ask you for our audience is if you could, briefly give them a sense of what we mean when we say Kyivan Rus, and also to give us a sense of the history of the term Rus, because we will find out that it's very important to get the history right if we want to understand what we're talking about when we talk about Kyivan Rus.
Mille grazie, Lodovico. Thank you so much for this moment, for answering your very interesting question, because it's an old tradition, maybe 300 years, historians discuss why we use. Well, we know the term Rus from the second half of the 9th century. Some people from Scandinavia search a new land, a new road for trade, exchange, new slaves, gold, and maybe some silver. For example, they discovered a new territory in the middle current of the Dnieper, situated now in the center of Ukraine, modern country. One group for the Scandinavians stood near the place known as Kyiv. However, a small part of the Scandinavian warriors discovered a new route to the Black Sea and Byzantium Empire, with the gilded capital of Constantinople, actual Istanbul. It's a short version that answers the simple question: how do Scandinavians appear in Kiev, and how the Rus name takes for territory nearby. However, the early medieval state has the name Rus. All know from the 10th to mid of 13th century, expansive territory ruled by dukes from the Rurikid clan used the name of the controlled lands with the many centers of power reaching from, for example, from Novgorod on the north and Pereyaslav on the south, and Volodymyr, it's Ukrainian, Volodymyr city on the west, and, for example, Ryazan in the east. Also, at this time, before Mongol expansion, Rus is a common name of the territory controlled by all Rurikids, member of big clan. But we need to remember, from the middle of the 12th century, this domain is disintegrated into a lot of formally independent territory. And the next period of history, we historians use the term Rus for the different meaning. In the Ukrainian grand narrative or Ukrainian perspective of history from the 14th century, we used Rus to describe the territory around the main cities on the modern western part of Ukraine, for example, the city Halych, Lviv, Peremyshel. From the 1474, this territory is a new administrative unit of the Polish kingdom, It's a main question because it's a name of this administrative unit is a Rutenian voivodeship. Lviv is the main center of this voivodeship, and we have the little disconnect between using Rus and Rutenian. Well, Rutenia is a Latin version of Rus. We need to remember the Latin is the lingua franca of the medieval and early modern Europe. And continued this, your question, why did Moscovia and rulers of Moscovian Principality use Rus and Russian from the second part of the 15th century? In my opinion, to understand this combination, we need to look to the history of the Orthodox Church of the big territory in the central and the east of Europe. When the political crisis and catastrophes started in Rukit's principality in the middle of the 13th century, the Kievan metropolitans looked for a new place and a new protectors for themselves. Sometimes they lived in Volodymyr or Suzdal, in the independent principalities center in the northeast of old Rus territory. But from the end of maybe 14th century, these metropolitans like Moscow for a stable place for residents and good protectors for themselves. In the mid of 15th century, the metropolis of Kiev split in two parts, and one of the formal center in Kiev, but the actual executive center in Vilna, capital of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and the new Orthodox metropolis in Moscow. And Moscow and Moscow principalities used this situation for our propaganda and a little bit of splendor for themselves. In 1472, the great prince of Moscow, Ivan III, married one interesting girl. It's the name of Sophia Paleologina, is a niece of last Byzantine emperor. She brought to Moscow an imperial arrogance and pride, the idea of the third Rome. From this time, Moscow Prince Ivan III carried over imperial ambition, and his grandson Ivan the Terrible started using the imperial title Tsar from the 1547. And conclusion, your question, after then, for the mid of 16th century, all rulers of Moscovia supported the imperial rhetoric and replaced it Moscow with a large name, all Rus. Sorry, I don't hear. You mute.
I muted myself. Sorry, I muted myself to avoid any echo. So no, what I was going to say is that basically the idea that I think is quite important for our audience to understand is that at the time when we had Kyivan Rus, which was this medieval state ruled by a Scandinavian dynasty and centered around Kiev, there was no such a thing as Muscovy yet at the time, originally. Am I correct?
No. Okay, when did formally Moscow becomes Russia after the end of the Great Northern War in the first quarter of 18th century? But the process of construction of propagandistic versions started in the middle of the 16th century, when I say before, and when the start of using added to title Tsar of all Rus. And the next theme is it's a combined episode Russian and Ukrainian history, because in the middle of the 17th century, after Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising and agreement in Pereyaslav, when Cossacks hetman with their elites and warriors pledged to Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, after the military campaign in the 1655, Tsar added to this title a new combination, the Tsar of all little and White Russia. It's a very important moment. The first part of this title, A Little Russia, it covers all lands controlled by Cossacks and the Khmelnytsky uprising. And the second part of this title covers a part of the eastern provinces of the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth, now is a territory of Belarus state. After this political and military victory, Moscow Tsar and Moscow elites started actively using all rules on all combination of political and themselves propaganda. And the next moment, it's a very important moment, in the 1686, Moscow annexed Kyivan metropolis. When we know the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in now, it's a very complicated situation because it started in the second part of 17th century. This action added a new impulse to the perception of ideas that Moscow is the center of all Rus and all Orthodox people. And the new ruler of Moscovia, Peter the Great, started the process of modernization of the country, and the Great Northern War and victory over Sweden created a new empire. But empire have a new name. It's a Russian Empire. After the proclamation or a new version of the state, many scholars, historians, and Orthodox leaders, it's interesting point, many Orthodox leaders studied in Kiev, contributed to cementing the Russian imperial idea. It's make Ukrainians hands construct Russian Empire. It's a small episode of this big history. And Russia appropriated the legacy of Rus with the central in the Kiev. And Western states recognized Russian Empire as a partner and had to accept its version of history as well. It's a very important episode of because Ukrainians and Ukrainians land do not have any state from mid of 14th century, but Moscovia and Russia have a state. And generally, modern Russia needs, for my opinion, a new conception of its origin, because for 300 years they use a version of the history. This version of the history started in Kiev because it's very problem and confused with the geography, because distance between Kiev and Moscow may be 800 or 900 kilometers. It's a very big distance for European history, and for example, in the German empires, in this territory, maybe 10 or 20 small states, for example. But it's a very difficult problem for historians. In academic discussion with a normal historian, it's not problem. But history is not only academic. It's we say we saw Russia history. It's a really deadly weapon in hand of actually rulers of modern Russia.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting, especially the last thing you said of how history can become this weapon that is used today to not just to explain the past, but to justify actions that are happening right now. And it's quite startling if one thinks about it, that basically, I mean, one of the many reasons of what's happening right now, it's how you kind of use or abuse something that happened hundreds of years ago, or actually even 1,000 years ago in the case of Kyivan Rus. And I was wondering if you could maybe expand a bit on how history has been used and abused by the Russian leadership to kind of justify their action, and how that has developed in our modern times?
Well, it's very important question how Russian rulers used this weapon, because we need to understand transition. And when we have Ukrainian for this narrative of history. Okay, maybe we have a long way in history from Rus to Ukraine, or from Rutenia to Ukraine. And the first mention when we see Ukraine in written sources dates from the 12th century. However, the first meaning of this word is a land near the border, or some part of borderland, because medieval and early modern sources use the term Rus for different place. Answer your previous questions, I say about the Ukrainian perspective, Rus, it's a number of lands around Lviv, Halych, and other western states of actually Ukrainian state. But we have interesting paradox. Many documents in a late medieval and early modern period of history use the term Rus for this land. At the beginning, for example, for the beginning of the 18th century, when the Swedish army occupied Lviv, one author of diaries about this occupation said, it's the first time when Lviv, the capital of Rus, was occupied. They used term capital of Rus for not Kyiv, but for Lviv. But we have a parallel meaning of term of Rus on this time. This is a territory of the part of the Polish crown and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, where Orthodox beliefs live. And this parity exists for the middle of the 17th century, before the Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising. Ukraine was a small part of Kyivan voivodeship. But after the uprising, the term expands to the other region, and both banks of the Dnieper River will start covered term of Ukraine for big territory. And the Ukrainian territory, when we say Ukrainian for middle of the second part of 17th century, was divided between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Moscovia in the 1667, when the next century elites from the left bank of Dnieper River constructed our version of primary history and started with a center in the Kyiv, and fought for independence from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the middle of the 17th century. And however, the empire eliminated all Cossack institutions and converted this territory to normal administrative provinces ruled from St. Petersburg in 1764, because used not correct term for Ukrainian land, Malorossia. For example, I remember in Italian scholars used for describe Ukrainian term Piccolo Rosso or Piccolo Russo. But the old Cossack elite saved the memory of the old times and discussed how to transform and adapt their position to a new reality. It's important, very important moment. In this discussion, the idea of not Little Russia or only Ukraine was born. In applied to the territory of the left bank of the Dnieper River, but with the capital in a Kyiv state, and in the right bank. With the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and integration of provinces of the right bank to Dnieper River to Russian empires, this idea of Ukraine began to spread over these lands as well. And the constructed common history came along with the name of Ukraine. It's different meaning, the different new term for people, because people use different name for other Ukrainian regions, because Ukraine it's a new idea from the 19th century, and in the second part of the 19th century, this idea of Ukraine was accepted by, first of all, elites in Galicia in the Austrian Empire, and elites on pro-Ukrainian leaders in the main cities in the Russian Empire, in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Poltava, Chernihiv, and around this problem. It's a short version of the invention of the concept of Ukraine. It's a state on the great borderlands between Europe and Asia.
And since you've kind of given us a very good overview of how the notion of Ukraine has developed and how it moved across the territories that are contemporary Ukraine, how would you best characterize the historical difference between and the tension even and the contrast between this new notion, this new ideal of a Ukrainian nation, and the more kind of imperialist notion of Russian world, of Ruski Mir, that was attempting to englobe not just what we regard as Russia, Russian territory today, but also what today are neighboring states such as Ukraine and Belarus and so on.
It's because if you know a new idea of Russian rulers, a new law when describe when people speak in Russian, it's a Russian territory or Russian, or it's a people for material for construct Russian Ruski Mir, but it's not true. Because first of all, Ukraine has a different history and different experience. We need to remember the modern Ukrainian tradition is based of the various of historical institution, because we have a history of institution. It's European tradition started in late medieval period of Ukrainian history. But the modern Ukrainian nation was formed in the second half of the 19th century in two different empires. It's the Russian and Austrian, but the latest Hungarian before the Great War. Ukraine belonged to two empires. We need to remember, two empires, it's very good for construct modern Ukrainian nation. Some Ukrainians have endured autocratic tradition based on the strong power. It's all European and world people see every day when Ukrainian fight with Russian soldiers. But Ukrainian region, for historical perspective, have a different tradition of communication with the state. The western part of Ukraine follows the tradition of Enlightenment, rules of Austria, and remember old time of self-government in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But the next region to across to the Dnieper in the right bank of this great river for Ukrainian history of Ukrainian geography remembers the tradition of self-government. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth started in 15th century and continued to the 18th century to a partition. But the Hetmanate territory on the left bank of the Dnieper and former autonomous territory in the Russian Empire in the 19th century continued this tradition and added specifies military Cossack tradition of self-government, because this territory contained from the military unit Polk. And the southern provinces in Ukraine as a mixture of Cossack and self-government tradition was an anarchist experience. It's an important episode of Ukrainian modern history from a revolutionary year in the end of the Great War in 1917, 1921. But for my opinion, we have a common problem with the national construction project. It's specific of Ukrainian way to national state, because we don't have Ukrainian cities until the end of the World War II. Until the war, the majority of the population of the main cities of Ukraine were non-Ukrainians. It's a very interesting situation in all European, Central Europe countries, but it's create a modern nation with. It's very difficult to create a modern nation without Ukrainian urban communities. But after the World War II, the Soviet government did much to suppress the Ukrainian national movement. Beginning in the 1960s, the process of Russification of cities in the territory in Ukrainian began. Most of the industrial cities on the central, east, and the south part of Ukraine became Russian-speaking. This has survived to this day in the end. So throughout Ukrainian existence, Russia had used this strategy to promote Ruski Mir, Russian world, in our narrative and propaganda. But the difference between Ukraine is that not all parts of our country were part of the Soviet Union at the same time. Regions such as Galicia, Volyn, Transcarpathia, and Bukovina, it's small regions on the south and the west of Ukraine, become part to Soviet Ukraine after World War II in 1945, after Yalta and Potsdam Treaty Conference. But in some of these territories, particularly on Galicia and Volhynia, Ukrainians armed resistance to Soviet rule last until maybe the mid of 1940s. No, it's very different situation for all Soviet territory, because no part of the Soviet Union had such this type of experience. At the beginning of Perestroika in the mid of 18th, the participants of these events were still alive and told about our experience when young fight from Soviet soldiers in domestic forest and mountains. But Russia and Russians never questioned who they are. It's why it's a big country, but not say a simple question: who they are. When the Soviet Union disintegrated into the Russian leadership in the 1991 or 92, its elites of Russian Federation, instead of creating a new Russia, immediately began rebuilding, but rebuilding not Soviet, but Russian Empire was an element of the Soviet Union politics for the people. But the empire that wanted sameness and subjugation and did not respect otherness and did not respect self-governments for Russian people, for example, because Russian people need to understand self-government. It's a very important institution in European tradition, but we don't accept self-government tradition. We're not European nation, for my opinion.
I just want to, if that's okay, I just wanted to go back to something you said earlier if that's fine, which is, you mentioned how basically Ukraine was, for the Ukrainian national sentiment developed under two different empires, of course, the Russian Empire on one side and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire on the other side.
Yeah.
But why is it that still, like to this day, in Western Europe, there is this perception that the only player was the Russian Empire? Like most people don't even most people, I'm not talking of course about academics and specialists, but I'm talking about like the average person. When they think about Ukraine, they think about the Russian Empire. They don't remember, or they're not aware of the influence of Central and Western Europe in Ukraine, and how history of part of Ukraine is much more connected to European history rather than to Russian history. Why is it that this perception of history has established itself so successfully in Europe?
Well, it's a very important time and a very important program for all. I say a simple statement. All people know some version of history, but Russian version of history, Ukrainian, German, French, Italy, Spain, for example. But sometimes we have a positive, sometimes it's negative version of our history, of other history. But Ukrainian situation, it's we need to remember the Ukrainian stay independent country in the 1991, and we start from this year teach and learn our history in school and university, because this history, it's a different. We start study this history from its different version, because this process is not easy. For example, when we have only 30 years studied Ukrainian history in the educational system of Ukraine. And when young children started studying history in the start of independence of Ukraine, they faced worldview conflicts in their families. Their families, not other countries, only families. Parents, for example, studied the Soviet generally pro-Russian version of history, because grandparents studied the late Stalin's version of history, and generally we have one family and three versions of history that different, because we don't remember 30 years. It's very short time for history. Today, Russia have used big budget for TV, for internet sites, social media, to advance only their version of history. And in this version of Russian history, Ukraine does not have its own history. It does not have its own state. And we say, actually, it's a military aggression, Russian to Ukraine. It's one of this element cancellated Ukrainian nation and cancellated Ukrainian modern state. Therefore, the land of Ukrainian does not belong to Ukrainians and can be taken over. But this is the justification. This is a history still known to all generation of Russian. This is a return to empirical rhetoric and the attempt to place Russia as the main rulers of a West territory. Please remember, we don't West territory. We have all long history from the start, from the 8th and 10th century. We have our capital in Kyiv. It's a big, perfect city on the state of the center of this big country, one of the biggest country of Europe.
Sorry, again, I was muted, of course.
That's no problem.
I think, I mean, what you said was actually, I mean, about having 3 different versions of history within the same family. That's actually
Yeah.
that's actually
I work with the students, and when some problems, because sometimes students have, my grandfather told another version of this episode of history, but my father another. I teach in modern school book of history, different element, because first, I remember, for example, I remember my study in university in the first year. The very old professor who started history in 1930 in Leningrad, in lecture, describe one episode after Khmelnytsky uprising. It's a Battle of Konotop. We use Ukrainian, modern Ukrainian history books because we know Cossack hetman was a Tatar support, won this battle near Konotop. But the old professors say, no, Moscow troops won this battle. It's a very confused different generation who study history for another time, for another political situation, and for another books, because sources, 1 or 2, take one version of this battle. It's one example for my experience when I teach history in the university.
that's incredibly fascinating, and it actually makes understand how difficult it must have been, 30 years ago, with all this baggage of different versions of history, having to kind of start from scratch, having your own version of history that is independent of that baggage. I mean, you're right. It's incredibly short in terms of time. 30 years is not that much.
Yeah, it's not more. I remember one episode of the celebrate 100th anniversary Great French Revolution, when the president of France discussed with the ambassador of China Empire and say, have you mean about 100 university? The ambassador said, it's not more time. We need observe 100 year for history and construct of modern state in Europe. It's not time.
Yeah, it's not enough to to completely grasp the effect of it and the impact of it in the longer run. And I mean, to be honest, because you've been mentioning some really actually interesting anecdotes. I know it's not necessarily something that we discussed beforehand, but since you mentioned them, I thought they were quite interesting and quite fascinating, even for our audience. What would you say? What would you say? I know this is not a question maybe that we discussed before, but what would you say that today in Ukraine is? What's Ukraine's relationship with this history today? Like, how has it evolved in the past few years, given how tense the situation has been?
In this situation, all Ukrainians is take one position. We have our state. It's our state. We defend our country, our independence. We not discuss about original version of history of Ukraine. We not discuss about academic or popular version of history. It's not time for. It's not good time for this discussion, because after the war, historians and teachers make a new books, new academic and popular version of some episode of Ukrainian history. For example, I finalized a book about king in Ukrainian history from 14th to 18th century. For example, it's a new way for understanding Ukrainian history in a Polish kingdom and a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. New perspective. We need more books, more articles, more school books from Ukrainian history, from others, from the start of Kyivan Rus in the 10th century and for the modern period of independence. We have more work for we need work with European auditory and European publisher. We need publish Ukrainian perspective of history for more language, Italian, English, German, French, and when we maybe 20 after 20 years Ukrainian version of history, we need accept all European tradition and all European people who study history in our countries.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. It is true that very often when it comes to books about Ukrainian history, with, of course, the exceptions of the most famous one, it's very, very often difficult to find a translation in Italian, for example.
The
I
English
know. You go ahead.
My friends live in Italy and sometimes say, what do you mean about this period of history? Please send me a new information, because my colleagues, Italians, used Russian and Soviet version of this episode from history, and I search and prepare short information for Italian teachers, for example.
Yeah, you're right. On the other hand, and that's the thing why it's such a difficult trend to change, because on one hand, in some languages, Ukrainian texts are not translated that much, but at the same time, Russian and Soviet texts have been translated. So you're dealing
it's all
with
tradition.
Yeah, there is by now it's like an academic and
All
also
tradition and big investigation to our position in history and politics for many years, because Russian Empire started in the 19th century and continued to Soviet propaganda of the 12th century. It's good idea, because Ukrainian is a modern state. We need work in this.
Yeah. Look, I think we've run through our questions. I don't know if there was something else that you wanted to add specifically that you think you haven't had a chance to cover among the subjects we discussed. If there's nothing else that you'd like to add, I would just ask one more thing. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I would just like to ask you one more thing. Do you have any other interesting example of how of this idea of there being like multiple accounts of the same event, and how it differs? If you have some other like interesting example that you can think of, I think it would be quite interesting.
Modern or old time?
Whichever you think is more more explicative and kind of meaningful in the way the different accounts portray different versions, a different agenda in history?
Okay, I'd like tell my students a short history from the first part of 16th century. It's a this history presented a different history Ukrainian lands or Moscows. For example, in the court of one man stay on a court the first half of 16th century, and take about stolen personal belongings. And scrivener describe what stolen belongings for the peasants, not nobles, not bourgeois or people who live in the cities, but this peasant say, the thieves stole me 10 shirts from French materials. Next, 10 shirts from English materials. Belt from Hungarian leather with a silver elements, and Italian knives from the very good steel. For example, how peasants in Moscow have this list of European products in the first half in 16th century. It's a very different land and a very different, we have a very different history with Moscow Principality in the 16th century, for example.
Oh, that's very fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Vitaliy, thank you so much for coming. I think it was a very interesting conversation, and we're doing this because we want to spread as much information and awareness about the history of Ukraine, because we believe that we can't really understand what's going on in the present without the historical context. Unfortunately, for many people, and for the public, very often Ukraine kind of appeared in the news in 2014 and then kind of disappeared and appeared again now in 2022, and it without the historical context is very often easy to be prey of misinformation and of false narratives. So it's really important for us to have you here and discuss about this. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Ludovico, for this experience. It's very interesting for me, but we need to remember two elements: context and everyday working for people. Historians need to remember these 2 points.
Thank you. Thank you so much.